Hello, everyone. Today we'll be doing a demo debate on the topic resolved juveniles who commit violent crime should be treated as adults in the criminal justice system. Speaking first on the negative side will be Maddie Cahill and Conrad Pallor. And then speaking second on the affirmative side will be Melissa McCartan and Arnab Sarkar. So Maddie, you can take it away.
Great. As long as everyone's ready, I'll start my 4 minutes now. Contention 1 is abuse. Sending juveniles to adult prisons results in unwarranted abuse, and this happens in 2 different ways. Subpoint A is physical abuse. Youth incarcerated in adult prisons are more likely to experience physical abuse and violence. Human Impact's partner explained in 2017 that incarcerated youth are exposed to physical abuse and violence, unacceptably high rates of violence, unchecked gang activity, and living in unit overcrowding. Young people housed in adult correctional facilities are twice as likely to be beaten by staff and 50% more likely to be attacked with a weapon than youth in juvenile facilities. Even if young people manage to escape direct physical abuse, exposure and proximity to violence can be harmful in and of itself. Subpoint B is mental health. Incarcerated youth face psychological harm, comparatively worse in adult prisons in comparison to juvenile prisons. The Human Impact's partner in 2017 writes that incarcerated youth face psychological abuse, mental health issue, and identity impacts. Qualitative research in a 2000 study showed that young people in adult facilities have high rates of anxiety and depression due in part to their fear of being victimized or experienced incarcerated persons. The impact is twofold. First, an increase in crime. Abuse in the adult prison system makes juveniles more likely to commit more crimes once they're released. Human Impact's partner continues in 2017 that several large-scale studies have found that higher recidivism rates among juveniles tried and sentenced in adult court. A matched case control study comparing Florida youth tried as adults with youth tried as juveniles found that youth tried as adults were more likely to recidivate. Policies allowing youth to be tried as adults typically result in greater subsequent crime, including more violent crime. Second is excess mortality. As the Human Impact's partner concludes in 2017 that juvenile incarceration is associated with negative health outcomes as an adult, including early death. Mortality rates were nearly 6 times higher for youth that had been transferred to the adult system than for the county population. Contention 2, rehabilitation. The juvenile criminal justice system has an emphasis on rehabilitation. Deanne Allen explains in 2002 that juvenile courts have traditionally professed to focus on the best interest of the child. Juvenile courts are committed to rehabilitation, and this is premised on the belief that children are less culpable and they are worth saving. By contrast, adult prisons experience punishment at the expense of rehabilitation. As Young explains in 2000, that children in adult facilities, particularly in jails, frequently do not receive education or other services appropriate to their needs. Few adult correctional facilities provide special programming developed for juveniles, and most states do not provide special staff training on handling children. This situation for girls is particularly troublesome because there will often only be one female offender under 18 in a particular prison, and therefore little likelihood of any specials. The impact is increased crime, as recidivism is a massive problem of released prisons. Lober in 2013 explained that 2/3 of released prisoners are rearrested within 3 years, and more than half of released inmates are returned to prison. Fortunately, rehabilitative programs decrease recidivism, as Adofia explains in 2016 that most criminological research strongly supports rehabilitation over both deterrence and incapacitation strategies. On average, appropriate treatment was found to cut recidivism rates by 53%. For these reasons, my partner and I strongly urge a vote for the negative.
My time will begin now. We affirm resolved, juveniles who commit violent crimes should be treated as adults in the criminal justice system. Our sole contention is ensuring due process. In the status quo, juvenile courts fail to uphold the due process rights that juveniles deserve. Beckheiser writes that due process requires a procedural regularity lacking in juvenile court proceedings. Specifically, there are two ways in which juvenile courts circumvent due process. The first is by eliminating procedural safeguards. Feld confirms that despite juvenile courts increasing an explicit punitiveness, they still provide delinquents with fewer and less adequate procedural safeguards than those available to criminal defendants. The primary problem with these juvenile courts is that there is confusion between procedural and substantive aspects. Feld continues that procedure and substance intertwine inextricably in juvenile courts. The increased procedural formality individualized dispositions towards more punitive offense-based sentences. Despite the criminalizing of juvenile courts, most states provide neither special procedures to protect youth from their own immaturity, nor the full panoply of adult procedural safeguards. The second way is by eliminating juries. Juvenile courts have no checks on judges because the right to a jury does not exist. Ainsworth writes that using juries as fact finders provides a host of advantages to anyone, adult or juvenile, accused of a crime. Juries serve as a buffer for overzealous prosecutors and a check on the rogue judge who is biased or capricious. Juveniles denied a jury trial lose out twice. They are more likely to be convicted in the first place and are less likely to prove an error of law which could allow them to prevail on an appeal. Juvenile courts are based upon the discretion of judges. Feld writes that despite statutes and rules, juvenile court judges make discretionary decisions effectively unconstrained by the rule of law. If judges intervene to meet each child's real needs, then every case is unique and decisional rules or objective criteria cannot constrain clinical intuitions. Judges will impose haphazard, unequal, and discriminatory punishment on similarly situated offenders without effective procedural or appellate checks. There are no juries in juvenile courts to check back for these individual biases. Sanborn writes that judges have been found to be biased against juveniles because they have discovered the defendant's record before trial, remember the youth from a previous crime or from previous hearings for the current offense, or learn the child had been held in detention. Judges also have been accused of convicting youth on evidence that did not measure up to beyond a reasonable doubt. These varied sources of bias affect the youth's ability to receive a fair trial when there is no option for a jury trial. Empirics show the increase in arbitrary rulings when they are bench trials compared to jury trials. Pacadopaz writes that minority juveniles comprise nearly 9 out of 10 of the youth whom prosecutors sought to waive. For these reasons, being treated as adults provides better checkbacks on abusive procedures and rulings. Ainsworth continues that those who have jury trials receive more meaningful appellate review than those who are tried in bench trials. Judges presiding over jury trials must articulate the law governing the case and jury instructions, which are later subject to appellate review to correct errors of law. In trials that most juveniles receive, on the other hand, prejudicial errors of law can easily go undetected because they are not articulated. Upholding this due process is key to fair trials. Steiger writes that due process clause not only ensures fair procedures, it also is the source of certain substantive limits on government power. The impact is deterring wrongful convictions. The violation of due process in juvenile courts causes wrongful convictions. Juvenile courts may be a breeding ground for this. Juvenile court culture discourages zealous advocacy in favor of the best interests of a minor, meaning that innocent defendants may not have their cases fully heard. Lesser penalties in juvenile courts, including widespread use of probation, provides powerful incentives for the accused to plead guilty to crimes they did not commit to avoid incarceration. Overall, there are thousands of wrongfully convicted people each year, trapping them in cycles of inescapable poverty. For example, exonerees in the NRE database served a combined 20,000 years behind bars. More than half of the exonerees in the database have never been compensated. Exonerees receive less compensation when they get out, on average over $42,000 less per year. Thus affirm.
Ready for cross?
Yes.
All right. I'll start the time now. Do you mind if I ask the first question?
Go for it.
Okay, so what is the difference between procedural and substantive things in like trials?
So what we tell you in our case is that specifically in juvenile courts, there are not certain procedural safeguards that will determine the outcome. So an example of this would be like certain safeguards that would allow like the child to not be like perceived as immature just like simply because of their age. And so because there are these procedural differences, like, not having juries, we say that that makes it more likely that there are wrongful convictions. Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. So at the top of your case, when you talk about violence in the prison system and for those people who are incarcerated,
Right.
is there a reason that like that the risk of violence is higher in a adult prison compared to a youth prison?
Well, yeah, I'd say that first, the staff is much more violent in adult prisons than it is in juvenile prisons, because in juvenile prisons, the staff is trained to interact with children. So that's one of the reasons why it's better for them to be in a juvenile facility, but also just that they're in a space with older and more experienced criminals. And that is like a breeding ground for psychological and physical abuse, because those people surrounding them are much more violent and they're in a much more vulnerable position. Could I ask another question?
Sure.
Okay, so what's the definition of due process?
The definition of I mean, I don't have a quote to read out to you, but basically what it is, it's that everyone has certain protections. So when they undergo, certain burdens need to be met, certain accommodations have to be reached. And like, presume innocence until proven guilty, all of that. Could I ask
Right.
you a
So
question?
isn't due process being met? Isn't could I ask
Sorry, wait, sorry, there was a lag. Yes, yes.
isn't due process being met in the juvenile system right now?
No, we argue that it's not, because we argue an essential feature of due process is having a jury, because a jury checks back on biases made by one individual judge. And so we say when you don't have that, you don't have due process, because you're leaving it up to the arbitrary decision of one judge. And what's even more than that is like it's based on that judge's like their own opinion entirely. There's not like set guidelines for how they do their sentencing, which we say is going to be a really big problem.
All right, you can take the last question if you want.
Um, so yes, I wanted to ask you about the mental health facilities that are in juvenile prisons. Can you just say more like what services are offered?
Well, the mental health subpoint is really about that young people placed in adult facilities face more psychological harm.
Oh,
So
okay.
I think that is like, so that's in part by them being surrounded by adults, but also like any kind of mental health resources for children are going to be better in juvenile facilities because people are trained to deal with children.
Okay, that's fine.
Is everybody ready? Start with an overview to my opponent's case. Due process doesn't just stop in the process of sentencing. The topic asks us to look at the entirety of the criminal justice system. Our interpretation is that due process concerns to what is fair and what is just, and this doesn't just stop at the moment in which a trial happens. It also extends into the criminal justice system and the act of actually serving sentences. So our first contention also shows that the adult system undermines due process through things like abuse, right? There's no procedural right to be abused in an adult prison, which means that we also show that we're undermining due process, proving that our case is a prerequisite to their arguments. But now let's go to their entirety of their case. You can lump their first two links together. Essentially, it's just about how there's perceived procedural safeguards in the adult system that are lacking in the juvenile system. We think that this is incorrect for a number of reasons. First, juveniles don't get fair trials in adult court. In fact, there's psychological biases among adult jurors and poor legal representation. Cecilia Harris explains in 2017 that unlike juvenile court, adult courts involve trial by jury. Jurors may be biased against youth people who are tried in adult court. The mere fact that a young person is transferred to an adult court carries negative connotations that prompts jurors to be more likely to deliver guilty verdicts. Public defenders may be unable to provide the time and individualized attention that youth and their families deserve. Second, Youth tried outside of the juvenile justice system receive tougher sentences for the same crime. The human impact partners continues that when young people are transferred outside of the juvenile system, they're more likely to be convicted and typically receive harsher sentencing than those who remain in juvenile court charged with the same crime. My third argument is that these juveniles have less legal representation. In fact, when youth are tried in adult courts, they are less likely to have effective legal representation. The juvenile system is far better because they don't need legal representation because they're simply a judge. And the judge assumes the role of stare decisis, so they assume a parental role in which the emphasis is on rehabilitation. The purposes of having judges is to ensure that there is rehabilitation. And that is really crucial. Then, their second link talks specifically about why juries are better than judges. However, turn this argument against them. Adult courts, or argument is non-unique. Adult courts are also just as bad as judges. In fact, Jukiewicz explains in 1999, in 9 of the 10 jurisdictions, African-American youth were disproportionately charged in adult court by adult trials. This means that the proportion of African-American youth whose felony cases were filed in the adult court was higher than the proportion of African-American youth who were arrested for felony offenses. My second argument is that this argument is false. Judges don't determine sentencing based on how much they like any particular victim, but do it based on state and county-wide procedures. The implication is that this process isn't on net bias. My third argument is you can turn the argument against them, as one of the benefits of the juvenile system is secrecy. Youth sentenced as adults are not able to get the record sealed, setting them up for negative lifelong consequences, such as barriers to employment, civic engagement, and health. Essentially, when you have a judge that makes decisions, it doesn't go on the youth's permanent record. But when you're tried in the adult system, this goes on their permanent record, meaning that these individuals are less likely to get a job in the long run. In fact, Legal Match explains that a conviction in adult court can have worse consequences on a person's life after jail, in which there's higher likelihoods of things like poverty. But then their impact talks about how people are more likely to take plea agreements, but the empirical data doesn't support this. In fact, Human Impact Partners explains in 2017 is that the mere threat of prosecutorial direct file in adult prisons can put enormous pressure on a young person to accept plea agreements in order to avoid being tried in the adult criminal justice system. Essentially, the threat that they might be tried with a jury means that individuals are way more likely to accept plea agreements, which means that their impact is not really that true. And for that reason, I strongly urge a vote for the negative.
It's going to go down our case and then down the negative case. Is everyone ready? Okay. Let's start off with this overview. Conrad says that the big problem with our case is that due process doesn't just stop at the criminal justice system, but he misunderstands the topic. The topic is about how we should treat adults in the criminal justice system, not in jails, which is why we are actually a prerequisite to this argument, because we're going to say that the way you frame the debate is how we treat individuals before they get to jail in the first place. Before they get to jail, you can prevent these minors from actually getting into the system, and that is what our entire case talks about. Let's go to our first argument. They say that there's not fair trials happening right now, and that's because they're transferred over and there's a lot of problems with the system. But there's two fundamental issues here. First, statistically, it's untrue. Our Berry evidence does a comparative, finding that when there is juvenile trials and when there are adult trials and those same juveniles are tried, there is a reduction in the chance that they're actually put into prison and that they get higher sentences. But second, the reason why juries are more likely to look apprehensively on juveniles that go to the adult system is because they have the choice to go to the juvenile system. But in a world in which all juveniles are treated under the adult system, this bias doesn't exist. The next thing they say is that the next thing they say is that there's a bunch of problems if juries with the system in which jurors are biased. But this is only true if the jurors. This is only true in a system in which the judge doesn't have jurisdiction over what the jurors are able to do. We say, and our evidence specifically says, that when jurors have the ability to check back for judge biases, it does actually reduce the amount of recidivism. It does reduce the fact that they go into incarceration. The next thing they say is that these people don't get legal representation. But again, the inverse is actually true. Right now, the only legal representation they have is a judge. judge. But in the scenario in which they're tried in the adult system, they have legal representation, then they can fight back against things that cause them to be falsely accused. And then they say that they turn it by saying that adult courts are actually really bad because they cause a lot of problems with African Americans. But we say on balance, our Berry evidence finds that juveniles are more likely to get out of these crimes and they're less likely to go into the prison system if they have juror courts, which means that on balance, you still reduce the amount of people that are going to jail. Then they say that it's not true because these judges are actually just really good. That's really nice that Conrad thinks these judges are going to be really nice to kids, but they're not. In fact, the judges are more likely to be apprehensive towards them, and jurors are more likely to solve back for them. The last thing they say is that there's secrecy in the system, and that's why poverty goes up, because the jobs, like people that are employing you won't know if you have actually been imprisoned or not. But what our Northwestern evidence says is that even when you're in the juvenile court system, there are a lot of stamps of disapproval that ostracize you from jobs, which is why every year thousands of people get stuck in the system. The last thing they say is that you can still take a plea in the normal system. No, our argument is about having the choice to take a plea and having the choice to not do so. And our Northwestern evidence indicates that these kids do not have a choice in the first place. And that choice is what links us into the due process argument. Let's go to their case. At the top, you can group both of their subpoints. We are going to say if we win our case, we automatically win theirs for two reasons. First, if we prevent the incarceration that they say is so bad in the very beginning, then we prerequisite all of their arguments. But second, what Feld finds is that prisoners who are tried in the juvenile system are more likely to actually become adults by the time they get out. So the transfer happens internally. So if we can prevent them from getting tried in the first place and actually fight the juvenile system as an adult, then we're able to prevent long-term incarceration. Well, let's go to their impacts. Their first impact talks about how there's going to be a lot of crime. The problem is empirically this is untrue. What Boston College finds is there's a big deterrent on top of children when they're tried in the adult system. And empirically, what Levitt finds after 15 years of data is that they're less likely to commit crimes. Their second impact talks about mortality, but it's not about the adult versus child system. It's just about children being incarcerated. On their second contention about rehabilitation, you can turn this argument against them, which Levitt's 09 finds is that rehabilitation is actually really bad for children because they're in environments amongst other kids that are offenders, and they're 37 times more likely to commit crimes in the future, which is why independently causes more crime. Second, you can non-unique it though. Rehabilitation doesn't happen now to violent offenders. In fact, violent offenders go straight to the adult system. This feeds into our narrative for framing the round, because the question of the debate isn't should juveniles be in the system or not. It's whether or not they should have the ability to fight the criminal justice system in the first place. And that's why you should vote affirmative.
May I have the first question?
Yeah.
So in response to the argument about stigmatization of juveniles in the adult system, you say you remove stigmatization because they don't have a choice. The topic is that juveniles who commit violent crime should be treated as adults. Where does the topic indicate that juveniles who do not commit violent, like all juveniles are being treated in the adult system? It's only like the juveniles who commit violent crimes.
Yeah, so the courts that, handle.
So there still will be a stigmatization because they know that the severity of the crime was.
Right. Even if this is true, data, like 15 years of data that proves that even when we do that switch, there's still a reduction in the chance that they go to jail. And
let's talk about that. So you reference is Berry evidence, and I'm like looking at it right now, and the only thing that it talks about is the difference between procedural and substantive differences in the juvenile system. Where does it give this comparative analysis that says that there actually is more crime?
What the evidence? It says that judges intervene to meet the child's real needs, which causes objective criteria that are not constrained by clinical institutions, and they impose haphazard, unequal, and discriminatory punishment. And then the next card says that when there are, it's the Ainsworth evidence that says that juries serve as a buffer for overzealous prosecutors and check on rogue judges that are biased. And
so where is this 15-year comparative that says that there's more? They're more likely to be sent.
Yeah. That's the evidence I read in the bottle from Levitt that says that over 15 years of data, there is a reduction in crime when they're tried as adults.
Where did you say that?
It's a card I'd read in rebuttal. I can send it after.
Okay.
Okay. Let's talk about your argument about let's talk about this overview. So I'm trying to understand what this does for you in the round if due process is the process by which you get justice, right? What does that have to do with getting into prison?
Yeah, so the topic, I think it's good that you asked this question, is that it's should be treated as adults in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is not just the act of conviction. The criminal justice system is a broader process. It's the act of the trial process, but it's also the act of being sentenced and then being housed in a prison, right? So due process extends to all of these things, and it's just about having legal rights and things like fairness. And our argument is that due process extends to the fact that, when you're in the adult system. And so you make this prerequisite argument on my case that says that we're preventing people from getting put into the adult system in the first place. But my question is, are you preventing every juvenile from getting put in the adult prison? You just say that they're less likely, but that still means that there's some people that are getting put in the adult prison.
So the reason why this is important is because of the very last card in read and rebuttal, the Feld evidence. And the Feld evidence says that current juveniles that commit violent crimes, even if they're tried in the juvenile system, they still get transferred to the adult prisons. So the question isn't about whether or not they should be in those prisons. The question is about what sort of option should they have when they're tried in the first place.
Well, okay, so the question, that's not true for all jurisdictions. That's true for some jurisdictions. This topic
for juveniles that commit violent crimes. I can send the 15 years evidence.
We'll wait for that.
Hear me okay? All right, I'm gonna start on weighing my own case and then the pro case. Starting my time now. First on weighing, remember Conrad's overview that tells you that our case is a prerequisite to theirs. This is because the topic is referring to the entire criminal justice system, which means that due process is not just about before they go to jail, but about the entire process. That's why our case prerequisites, because the adult system is undermining due process by creating lots of abuse. But then outweigh on scope, because crime increases matter more than procedural fairness for society. That's always going to have a bigger and more long-term impact on the individuals that are being subject to this criminal justice system, and also on other people in general. When there's more violent crimes, that's worse for everyone. But then outweigh on probability, because they can't provide you with any evidence that clearly explains why juveniles will be arrested less. The only evidence that they give you really is Levitt, and that's completely outdated. It's about a study from 78 to 93. Our evidence is much more much more all-encompassing and also much more recent. Then moving on to our arguments. First, on our subpoint 1, remember that juveniles are more likely to be physically abused and psychologically abused. This is going to lead to much more lifelong impacts than any kind of impact in their case. That's why recidivism rates are much higher when juveniles are subject to the adult system. But then also remember that the HIP evidence says that there's going to be more the higher mortality rates for these juveniles that are in adult prisons. But then our second contention is the most important, because rehabilitation has always been shown to be in the best interest of juveniles, because Allen finds that juvenile courts focus on the best interest of the children. They say that they're 37% more likely to commit crimes once they are in the juvenile system, but they don't really explain to you why that's true at all. The Adrophia evidence is really clear, which says that most research actually indicates that recidivism rates are much lower with rehabilitation, because they're better to the juveniles, because the staff is more trained to deal with juveniles, and that's why it has cut recidivism rates by 53%. That's the biggest impact in the round, the most a lifelong impact, and that's the best piece of evidence. But then onto their case. Remember, extend Conrad's turns at the top of their case. His first turn says that all of these juries are going to have negative connotations of the juveniles, and they're more likely to get a bad verdict because of the fact that they're being transferred over to adult courts. They say that they don't have a choice, but that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily what that's about, because of violent crimes are the only ones that are being transferred over to adult courts, which means that these jurors are always going to feel more negatively towards those juveniles because they know that they've committed worse crimes. But that's why the HIP evidence says they're more likely to get worse punishments. But then remember the non-unique on their case from Levix that says in 9 out of 10 of adult courts, minorities were discriminated against just as much. It's completely non-unique that that juvenile courts are going to discriminate more. But then remember the turn at the bottom that these juveniles are going to be able to get their records sealed if they participate in juvenile court. That doesn't happen in adult courts, which means they have lifelong impacts of not being able to get a job and not being able to do anything productive with their lives once they're finally out of prison. It's much more likely that their lives end up being better if they participate in the juvenile criminal system.
Okay. Is everyone ready to go? I'm going to be starting on the framing and overviews. Okay. My time will begin now. My opponents want you to evaluate this round based on the criminal justice system in its entirety. We say that if you stop putting children into the criminal justice system before, at the first point in this link chain, at the trial stage, by not finding them guilty, there will be fewer people to experience all of the horrible things that my opponents detail in their case, which will happen in either world. My opponents make a critical error when they do not respond to the Feld evidence, which specifically says that regardless of where someone is tried, where a child is tried, they are still moved into adult prisons. What this means for the round is, number one, there's going to be children in adult prisons either way, so their whole case is non-unique. But number two, we solve for this uniquely because we're the only side reducing the number of people being put in jails in the first place. If they're going to end up in adult prisons anyways, my opponents gain no offense in this round. But more specifically, we can go into the details of their case. There's a couple problems here. So they extend this impact about increasing mortality rates by being in prison. The issue is this evidence is just saying kids in jail experience an increase in mortality. It's not specific to juvenile facilities. Again, what this means is we actually solve back for this. You can turn it because we are reducing the number of people sent to prison in the first place. Children are going to have longer lifespans. But the reason why you can vote for us is on our case where we tell you that we are going to restore due process by having juveniles accused of violent crimes tried in adult courts. What we say is that in juvenile courts, there's just one judge and their biases can determine the outcome. But when you are tried in an adult court, you have a jury, and just one person on that jury can find you not guilty, then you were not sentenced. That is why we reduce the number of people going to prison. My opponents offer a couple of responses. Number one, they say that there's still going to be negative connotations with among juries about these children. A couple things. Number one, our Sanborn evidence tells you that the juries don't have access to their previous records, unlike judges in juvenile court systems. What this means is the comparative is on our side because we say it's comparatively better when they have less information and their biases are going to be less severe. Number two, we say but number two, my opponents say there is a lot of discrimination going on against minorities. We say that is true across the board in the juvenile justice system and the adult justice system, but we reduce this by having a jury decide the cases instead of one judge, because one judge and their own biases can then determine the outcome. Now, in a situation where we have more procedural safeguards, if there is bias at play, that can be used on an appeal and we can overturn the ruling, less time in jail, more benefits. Their last response here is that juveniles get their record seals. Number one, we say from Northwestern that they get a stamp of disapproval. That's why they make $43,000 less per year. Second, we say this is up to the discretion of a judge. This is not universal. And without any counsel, it's hard for them to advocate to actually get this through. We say the chance of that goes up when they have proper representation in an adult court. And for these reasons, we urge you to affirm.
So I'll start with a question. So the topic asks us to look at juveniles who've committed violent crimes. And so your overview talks about basically the only that we prevent people from getting put into the system at all. So I guess I wanted to ask, of people that are tried in the adult system, you say that they're convicted less than in juvenile prisons, but is that 100%? Can you quantify? So at the end of the day, are you still putting people into prison?
So the thing is, we say that we garner offense in this round if fewer people experience the horrible things that your case details, right? We say that we get offense.
Why is that true though? Why would that be the case?
Because we are on net providing a better life for more people.
Okay, so I guess my question is that, so let's say you put less people into the criminal justice system, but the people that you're releasing are not rehabilitated. And those that you still put in the criminal justice system are more likely to commit violent crimes once they're released than in the juvenile system, then doesn't that impact more people?
All of this is non-unique because of our Feld evidence, which is also conceded, that says that right now, juveniles that commit violent crimes are already transferred to the adult system.
So I'll ask a question about that. Is that true? So in pretty much every country, in 188 out of 109, basically besides the United States, and only in 20 states in the United States, are juveniles actually able to be tried as adults? My question is, the resolution doesn't specify a jurisdiction.
We're talking about transferring. Once they're convicted, they transfer facilities.
The resolution isn't we can't debate in the absolute. Every country has a different policy on who goes to jail at what age. we have to assume there's some country, like in the countries that do not send juveniles to prison, like treat them like adults in the criminal justice system. Those are the ones we're talking about.
Okay. Would you like a question?
Yeah, sure. So I want to talk to you about this rehabilitation argument. So like, how good is rehabilitation? Like, because you say
Yeah. So we quantify how good rehabilitation is. I think that's a good question. So the consensus of criminological research indicates that rehabilitation is the best way to decrease crime in the long run. Rehabilitation cuts recidivism, which is the rate at which people go back to prison, 53%. That was a lower evidence at the bottom of our case.
Right. And that assumes people go to jail in the first place, though, right?
Yeah, but our argument is like, if you just release people, they're not going to get rehabilitated. So in some ways, that's just as bad. Like if you're releasing somebody who committed like murder, like that's not a good thing.
Right, but you're not releasing them from like a great system. You're releasing them from the adult system because these violent offenders don't.
No, we're releasing them from the juvenile system where they get counseling, educational programs.
Releasing kids that don't commit violent crimes from the juvenile system. You're not releasing violent offenders from the juvenile system.
No, our advocacy, your advocacy is treating.
Well, we're saying
our advocacy
no, but
what happens.
And also what I would say is if someone has been convicted of a violent crime, they are more likely to have a longer sentence. And by that time, they would be transferred into an adult facility, which is exactly what our Feld evidence says is happening.
Are you ready? Let's begin. Let's start with the overview to the round. My opponents make a couple of responses, but essentially the best way that you should advocate is for look at the entirety of the criminal justice system and what's best for society as a whole. They make a couple of arguments, is that they're preventing the amount of people that are put into the criminal justice system in the first place. However, they don't once quantify how many people they're not putting into the criminal justice system. And secondly, we outweigh with that argument because some people are inevitably going to get put into the criminal justice system because they have committed a crime. And because of that, those people are more likely to commit more crimes and more violent crimes in a world in which they're put into the adult prison system. And that's really crucial. They try to extend this Fed evidence that says that there's transfers. However, the line in the article says problematic violent youth have been subject to transfer to adult court. That's literally just what the resolution is, right? We're just saying that we shouldn't do that and that we should not allow that to happen. We're just assessing normatively that that is a bad thing that happens. It doesn't like non-unique or evident. That's just assessing what's happening right now. We're just saying that that's a bad thing. On our case, it's pretty clear. Our human impact partners evidence indicates is that juveniles who are put into the adult prison system are 50% more likely to be attacked, and they're more likely to have psychological abuse. Even if you think that there is transfer into the adult system after they turn maybe of age, that doesn't matter because at the point in which they're 9 or 10 years old and put with other adults, that's where the negative impacts happen, which is why our evidence indicates that getting put into the adult system doubles the rate at which they commit crimes afterwards, which means even if you believe that their arguments are true, that they're putting less people into the criminal justice system, those people aren't being rehabilitated. And once of those that are put into the prison system, they're more likely to commit crimes. On their case, the most important argument is that there's a negative connotation of juveniles. They say that negative connotation because they don't have the same information. Our argument is that they assume the worst, and that's equally as bad. And our evidence also quantifies that 9 out of 10 juries are racially biased. They don't even quantify how many judges are actually biased against juveniles. So at the end of the day, judges are probably more desirable because they uphold the rehabilitative attempt. They assume like a parental role, and they treat the process as educating juveniles so that they become better off in the long run. So judges aren't that bad at the end of the day, and we prevent more crime. For that reason, I strongly urge a vote for the negative.
This round comes down to who wins this overview. If you believe that the only thing that changes when you vote for the affirmative is what happens before you go into the prison system, you can very easily sign your ballot for the affirmative. Here's why you can do that. Our Feld evidence is functionally conceded in the last speech. Conrad even says that this is a card about the status quo and how the status quo is bad. That is more of a reason as to why you should change the status quo and prevent these juveniles from being tried in juvenile courts. Because we say that in the status quo, violent offenders are already going to be transferred over to the adult system. The question is what options they have in that system and if due process is upheld. We say that this happens because when you're put into the adult court system, those same individuals, as per our Sorensen evidence, have juries instead of individual judges. They extend this argument saying that the juries are super biased. We say that comparatively, they are less biased. Even if you believe that the quantification is great, that 9 out of 10 juries are really bad, that is in individual areas, but on balance, on a holistic level, they're always better than individual judges. And this is logically true. If you have one racist judge making jurisdiction over a single individual person that is being tried for a crime versus a jury, they're going to be better. Here's the reason why you can vote for us there. Because if we win that right now, the status quo already sends these individuals to adult systems, then all of their arguments are non-unique. These individuals are already stuck in the adult system. They're already facing poor mental health. They're already facing poor recidivism. The only question is, can we prevent them from going into that system in the first place? We tell you that when individuals are less likely to go into prison in the first place, they're less likely to get the stamp of disapproval, even if they're not incarcerated, that reduces their income every single year and makes them more likely to fall into poverty, makes them more likely to commit crime, and makes all of their impacts a lot worse. But even if you don't buy our case, they concede defense on their case, which also takes out the majority of their first contention, because we say that none of the impact evidence that they read is specific to adult prison systems versus juvenile systems. This is also conceded throughout the entire round, which means you know the status quo is bad. The only question is, how do you make the status quo better? And we believe that an affirmative ballot warrants that decision. That's why you should vote AF.